Hey, Mr. John Brewin is with us. Excited, thrilled, overjoyed to have the Premier League behemoth back in your world, John. How you doing? Great to have you with us.
I'm good. I thought you were referring to me as the Premier League behemoth there, but no. Good to talk to you, Joe, after all this time.
All this time, indeed. It comes around more quickly and more quickly the older we get. So, in some respects, much has changed, and in other respects, it does feel as if we're very much in for. And this happens sometimes, and other times they're changing of guards. This feels like we're in for a continuation of last season and maybe the season before, to an extent, whereby we have Man City against Liverpool, looking very much like they're better than the rest, and it will go down to the wire, give or take again, and it's more of the same, and off we go.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. The only thing to say about that is that during that rivalry, which I suppose has gone on for the last 4 or 5 seasons, both those clubs have suffered at least one blip, haven't they, where they've completely dropped off and allowed the other one to steal in and run away with the title. And I suppose if we're looking ahead to the season, which one of those is more likely to have the blip? I personally think, and okay, we're going to judge this off the Community Shield, always a bad idea. But Liverpool looked a bit more ready for the season than Manchester City in Leicester last week. And I think what you've got, actually, the thing that I've been thinking about these two clubs is they've both signed big strikers. And I mean big strikers. Obviously, the sight of Haaland lumbering around at Leicester, I wasn't ready for that. Now, I've seen Haaland play, but the sight of him in a Manchester City shirt with other City players playing their usual, that flowing football, the interchange that they do, and then this big guy up front who looked to me a bit like, remember when Stuart Pearce let David James loose as a goalkeeper, as a player up front? It reminded me of that. Now, obviously, this is Erling Haaland, one of the world's finest young athletes, and it looked to me as though that would take a while. And then, of course, you've got Nunez, a style of player that Liverpool haven't had for quite a while, you'd say. The galloping striker, probably the last of his I mean, they signed Andy Carroll. We can't really count him as much of a Liverpool player, but Fernando Torres maybe would be in that mould. So we're going back quite a way. One thing is, though, that they did play the false nine before with Roberto Firmino, who's been an excellent player for them. Obviously, he's possibly going to be phased out, or almost certainly being phased out over the years. Jurgen Klopp's a manager that's used to working with centre forwards. He worked with Lewandowski back at Dortmund. So Liverpool, more direct, seems to be more suited to this big man striker. Now, I'm one of the game's purists. I like the idea of getting it launched to the big man. And I'm looking forward to seeing those two strikers, to see the comparison and to see the change in focus, because it almost feels like in signing those two players, the game's two best managers have almost regressed to the mean of English football, which is the centre forward. And it seems like the 90s since we were talking about big centre forwards, the Shearer, Ferdinand, Dion Dublin, now Quinn era. I'm all for this. Is this what we're seeing? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. I do feel the discussion around Haaland this week, and to be fair, you're making points that many brilliant observers of the game have made. Jonathan Wilson was on last night, and he was writing about how Haaland seemed to be playing a different game to his teammates. I do feel there is a degree of silly season about this, and a degree of reading way too much into the Community Shield. Sometimes the simplest explanation is true. Haaland has scored 115 goals in 117 games post his career in Norway. He's going to score a gazillion goals for Manchester City. They're going to fit each other just fine. There's too much talent there. There might be a brief adjustment phase, but I mean brief. Even if he doesn't score in the next couple of weeks and takes a bit of time, I mean, if I gave you the over-under, all competitions, is Haaland going to break 30 goals this year with Man City?
I'm going to go for the under, but maybe not so far under, really.
So you do think definite growing pains?
Yeah, I think so. Now, this was put to me by a friend of mine this afternoon. I think this is quite a good point. Is that we've seen this with Pep Guardiola over the years. It's almost like he sets himself a puzzle to work out how to make things different. And Haaland is this season's puzzle, like his Wordle almost. How can a player like Haaland, who is completely not a Guardiola type of player, how can he make him work in his team? Now, I'm sure Jonathan and several others have made a comparison to Zlatan Ibrahimovic, but it's going back 10 years. Yeah. Pep's evolved as a manager since then. His teams don't play exactly the same football as they did back then. But is this some sort of rosebud thing where it's like, I couldn't make it work with Ibrahimovic, but I'm going to make it work with Haaland and prove that I can play different styles of football than the tiki-taka, tippy-tappy thing that other people criticise me for over the years. People criticising it's the best teams of all time, but there you go. But yeah, there will be growing pains, and when players sign for Manchester City, they have to fit into that system. There's been growing pains throughout that time, really. Jack Grealish is on his second season. You couldn't say that last season was the type of season that he would have hoped for. He made a contribution, but not nearly as much. You've got Riyad Mahrez, who perhaps in his first season didn't really make any sort of impact. When you consider that Mahrez was the best player in Leicester's team that had won the title, it takes a while under Guardiola. And Haaland, for all his talent, is not going to be immune to that, is he? There is going to be the growing pains, the phrase you used. And it being Manchester City, there's a plan B, there's a plan C. And, there are other players that can play in the forward line that have delivered for them in the years that Pep Guardiola's been at the club. So I don't think Guardiola's going to be too worried if Haaland doesn't work out. But fitting him into a team, assimilating him into a team, when you've got Liverpool, who perhaps look a bit more ready-made, charging up the table, that might present a problem for them.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I'd be amazed if there's problems here. I think he's just going to revel in this, to be honest, Haaland, and very quickly they'll figure each other out. You mentioned Grealish. His interviews post-season or in the immediate aftermath of the season last year were celebrated for being so forthright and honest, and they were brilliant. I think everybody warmed to Jack Grealish, actually, the way he was talking about how difficult he found playing at Man City. And in effect, it boiled down to Grealish saying, I just couldn't be myself, and possession was king, and it was only really in one or two games where he said he got a good early touch or an early goal, and he kind of thought, right, I feel like me again. He used that phrase, I felt like me again. And he talked about as well, just always been acutely aware of Guardiola's presence at training, like this intimidation and this kind of a person to be impressed. And it must be very difficult to be a player like Grealish, who's never had to worry about these things, to suddenly being almost self-conscious. That was what Grealish really was talking about. He was probably self-conscious for the first time on a football pitch, having come through this first season and then almost, voiced these kind of issues and maybe addressed them. Maybe, I mean, you'd love to know if Guardiola sat him down and said, "Wow, that was really interesting. I didn't know you felt that way," or let's see how we can map this out. Grealish to blossom in season 2 under Guardiola, like so many do, or do we think there's just an incompatibility there between Grealish and what he wants to do with the football and what Guardiola wants?
It's an interesting point you raise, isn't it? I mean, I think when Jack Grealish talked about that, it reminded me of the way that someone joins the military and essentially they break down your character and rebuild you. And that's the way you have to be for Pep Guardiola. Now, Jack Grealish doesn't really seem the military type, does he? He's more a maverick Tom Cruise type of guy, I suppose. Now, listen, he's a hugely talented player.
Yeah.
But having said that, one of Grealish's problems, I think, is that he's in a team in which there are players who are far more talented than him. So being yourself, okay, you could be yourself in Aston Villa, where you are the best player, you are the hometown king. But is Jack Grealish a more talented player than Phil Foden? I'm going to say no. Is he more talented than Kevin De Bruyne? Well, let's not be silly here. and Bernardo Silva. So you've got that group of players in which you're not first among equals. You're not among equals. You're almost like fourth in the group. They had Raheem Sterling, of course, last season, and he's moved on, which actually opens a space up for Jack Grealish, though, of course. And Gabriel Jesus has moved on as well. So Grealish has moved up the reckoning because players have moved on. Now Haaland has also come in. He'll be given the stage to do it, but I think from his point of view, his talent, such as it is, and his focus as well, has to step up as well. That's the point of working for Guardiola. He breaks you down to become a better player, and you have to respond to that. And I think Grealish's honesty was appreciated, though I do wonder how appreciated it might be by Guardiola himself.
Because I thought there was a very fair argument that Guardiola really damaged Grealish last season.
Yeah.
And didn't nurse him through the growing pains. Like, I do think Guardiola does have this standoffish quality to his character, and Grealish was obviously bereft of confidence. And where it really hit me that he had not ruined Grealish as a player, but really taken away something intrinsic, was at the Bernabeu when Grealish came off the bench against Madrid on that infamous night where City once again bowed out of the Champions League. And for the last maybe 10, 15 minutes, normal time and then into extra time, the real avenue for Man City, if they wanted to take it, was Grealish against Carvajal.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And there were times where Grealish was standing Carvajal up and there was 15, 20 yards behind Carvajal. And like the thing to do at that point was to risk possession, was to take him on, and was to try and make something happen. And almost every time that night, Grealish shewed the opportunity to do that, passed it back inside, because you could see him thinking, this is what Pep wants me to do. He wants me to keep the ball. And I dare say even Pep that night realised actually the way to go at Madrid here is to get Grealish taking Carvajal on, but he never did it. And I remember thinking that night, this is every bit as much on Pep as Grealish, that he's ended up in this state where he's got a 30-something-year-old right back and he's got the beating of him, and there's no other route through. It's a very crowded, congested situation, and he refused to take him on that night. And I kind of thought, Jack's only partly responsible for this.
Yeah, and if you pay £100 million for a player, you've got to try and make that player work. You have to accommodate them. Because you've got to answer to the bottom line of the club. Okay, City is a club where finances aren't too much of a concern. But I suppose, is there an argument that if you introduce Haaland into the team, you've already got Grealish there, that there's the possibility that Guardiola may be eyeing the team being a bit more direct than it was before, a bit more using speed on the counter, attacks including far fewer passes. I think that's a possibility. I think, again, because Manchester City are going for this season, they're going for 5 out of 6 titles. The only previous teams to match that are Liverpool, obviously 1970s, 1980s, and Manchester United. What was the thing that both those clubs did at the same time? They won the Champions League, of course, or the European Cup. Pep's ultimate goal is to find his way to win matches in by more ways than the one that keeps failing him on those big occasions. And it appears to me that maybe Grealish and Haaland could be the solution to that. Having said that, everything you say is correct, Joe, is that there's an uneasy relationship between him and Grealish, or there was, and there's a possibility that might be the case with Haaland. Manchester City, as I said, of the two big teams in the Premier League in the coming season, they're the ones with the bigger questions against them when they're the title holders.
Manchester United, the soap opera continues in various fronts. Dean Henderson now on loan at Nottingham Forest. Only on loan at Nottingham Forest, so I don't know how his current employers, what they'll make of the interview he's given. So, in effect, he's talking about how miserable his time at Manchester United was. He burst on the scene, obviously, at Sheffield United in a big way, and then went back to Old Trafford on the promise that he would be number one. Effectively, De Gea got injured towards the end of season before last, and so there was a sense Henderson's ready to take the mantle. But then he had COVID, and De Gea's form improved, and suddenly De Gea was number one for the year, and So Henderson is, well, talking about how there were false promises made to him now. He said, I turned down so many good loan offers last summer for the reason that I was being told I'd be the number one. So I turned down loans moves in the summer. And then they wouldn't let me go. To sit there, waste 12 months is criminal, really, at my age. I was fuming. And then he says of this summer that he basically got out before Ten Hag could see him. So he said, I didn't really want the manager to see me in training because I knew he'd probably want to keep me. So his confidence is still intact, we can say, Henderson.
Yeah.
I suspect he's gone through personally a really difficult, horrible time, and now has done the interview, and it's been destroyed by left, right, and centre. Danny Mills leading the charge as self-pitying and emblematic of all that's wrong with Manchester United.
Again, with Dean Henderson, one of the greatest issues you've got is you've got this great confidence. That's clearly been his calling card as a player. You know, when he was back at Sheffield United, he was talking about being the Manchester United number one at a time when, David De Gea, you throw it forward 20, 30 years, David De Gea is the only Manchester United player that can really carry his bat from the last decade, really, or the last 7, 8 years. You're asking a hell of a lot to step ahead of that. He was granted that chance. I'm thinking of a game against Liverpool, still in that sort of pandemic, behind closed door season, where it really didn't happen for him. He was made to look. There's one, internet meme at the time that showed that was deeply embarrassing for him. Now, this confidence aspect for him, he's always reminded me a little bit of Joe Hart. A similar style goalkeeper, actually, and similar confidence, and actually, funny enough, a similar penalty saving technique in the shootout, from what I recall. Trying to put off the opponent. He's obviously a vibes type of guy. And in the doldrums in which Manchester United found themselves, that clearly wasn't appreciated. I don't think he's the only player who felt that Ole Gunnar Solskjaer had his favourites and then didn't look beyond them, or felt that promises were made to them and not kept. I think other players have been, well, not so publicly explicit about it, but read between the lines of the various post-mortems of the season and speak to people at the club, and there was a lot of that went on. But you mentioned the Grealish interview of being incredibly revealing. Henderson's attempted something similar, but it's not really had the same effect, has it? I think Grealish develops a lot of public sympathy. Grealish is he's quite an endearing character, isn't he, when he speaks? And Henderson hasn't managed to achieve that. It's an own goal. This is a player that I think was linked with Newcastle. He's gone to Forest, who an ambitious promoted club. But that's one that rings alarm bells in the back office of clubs, isn't it? Well, this is the guy that complained about that, that appeared in all the papers. He seems to have shot himself in the foot there a little bit.
Just one other Manchester United question then before we move on, because I know there's always this sense of talking about them far too much, but Ten Hag has come out very publicly against Ronaldo and others, it must be said. I think Diogo Dalot was also guilty of leaving the Rayo Vallecano friendly at Old Trafford early. So Ronaldo played the first 45 minutes and then he was pictured leaving the game, and Erik ten Hag has described this as unacceptable. He said there were many more as well as Ronaldo who went home, and he's talked at length about how unacceptable this was. What's your read on the Ten Hag Ronaldo situation?
Well, when I read that had been his reaction, I felt it was absolutely the correct one. I think at a point before we've even kicked a ball, it's indicative of Manchester United that we're having these battles over players that should be leaving the club but aren't, and a new manager. Cast my mind back to this there was a similar sort of dispute, not quite the same detail, between Rooney and David Moyes. Remember in that first summer when David Moyes took over, a battle of wits, and it's one that I don't think David Moyes won. Erik ten Hag, let's not play national stereotypes, but in that very sort of Dutch fashion, was just, let's not mess around here. This is what I think about that. And Ronaldo, should he, well, I don't know if he even thinks like this, has to take his medicine for that. That's not how footballers behave. Okay, this is a 37-year-old, father, and one of the great figures of the game, but you still can't behave like that. Alex Ferguson would have dressed down, Brian Robson, Steve Bruce for that type of behaviour. That's what goes on. And I also think from a political point of view, Ten Hag's played it correctly because, okay, there might still be a rump of Manchester United fans that still think Ronaldo is Ronaldo. Ronaldo, let's face it, Ronaldo is just about the only example that Manchester United fans have ever had of having the best player in the world playing for their team. So many great memories. But those are memories. And this is not the same Ronaldo. And this is a new manager. And he's got to stamp his authority. And this is a point where any sensible Manchester United fan, I would suggest, has to realise that Ronaldo's time is gone. This is a new manager. It's best for all that Ronaldo moves on. We've got another month of this to come, I'm sure. But, well said, Ten Hag and Diogo Dalot. Well, you've done nothing really as a Manchester United player. What do you think you're doing?
Invariably, we break the Premier League table up into various sections. So we have Man City and Liverpool. We have the chase from Spurs and Arsenal and Chelsea. And I presume they're still aspiring to Manchester United. We have then at the other end those who are relegation threatened. So we have the promoted sides, and we have Leeds who just avoided it. We have Everton who have just avoided it, and Southampton, I suppose, we can call mid-table-ish. What of that kind of middle section that we never spend too much time talking about? So you've got West Ham, who had such a great season last year. They finished 7th behind United. And then we have Leicester, still, 2016 lingers in the memory, but increasingly distant. We have Brighton. We have Wolves. Newcastle are a special case. They finished 11th last year. You have Crystal Palace, you have Brentford, you have Aston Villa. This middle section with upwardly mobile aspirations.
Yes, yeah. And something that quite a few of those clubs share in common is that they haven't done a lot of business so far. Now, there might be several reasons for that. There's a financial crisis going on. There are greater regulations. The market is perhaps not as fluid as it used to be. But West Ham, talking to somebody last night, they're pushing actually to almost 100 million of signings. And this person who would know, I don't think they're too sure about the players that West Ham have signed. David Moyes has been granted a bit of control over that. Can they be better last season? Well, the plan is to be so. But we are beginning to wonder he's actually had 2 really good seasons, hasn't he, David Moyes, at West Ham, to push on for that. But then you've got a slightly different thing. Newcastle. Now, Newcastle have found it difficult to sign players and are now doing something which is quite familiar from clubs that come into money, is they're trying to pick off those around them, specifically Leicester. Now, there was a bid that went in 50 million for Harvey Barnes a week or so ago. That was rejected. Now they're in for James Maddison. Now, Leicester, I think, are a club to watch because look at their squad and you will see that there's about 26, 27 professionals in them. You're only allowed 25. You've got to ship out, from what it is said, is that they're rather overgeared on wages. The players like Vestergaard they bought last season haven't worked out. They've got players like Ryan Bertrand, who, I think he's got a year to go on his contract, but don't think he's got much of a place in the squad. And previously, Leicester were able to sell players on. Harry Maguire would be an example of that. And that hasn't happened. And also, Leicester have not bought anybody. Now, one of the reasons for that is that the Thai owners perhaps don't have the wealth that they did before because their business is in duty free now over the last couple of years, flights and so on, and duty free probably haven't been as prosperous as it used to be. So Leicester, from being there or thereabouts, pushing towards the top six in a couple of recent seasons, though not so much last season, although they did have that run in the Conference League, they possibly might plunge down. Now, you mentioned the 2016 title win, which came before they started to push into being one of those middle established clubs. They also won the FA Cup last year. Sure. Let us not forget. They've had a great time, but it may be that this is time that they have to regress a little bit. The only problem is that we've seen this an awful lot in Premier League history over the last 30 years, is that there are certain clubs that you look at and think, yeah, that club's established in the Premier League. And before you know it, that club is playing in the Championship. Stoke City is one that springs to mind. Middlesbrough. This type of club that you just think are always going to be around, and then they're not. And let's have to guard against that. Wolves are not dissimilar situation. Their owner, Chinese owner, obviously the Chinese economy has slowed up quite a bit. He is known as the Warren Buffett of China, but has a significant debt, which also is not particularly, it's not a good situation to be in. They've not got the money that they previously had to give George Mendes to go out and bring in his stable of players. They brought in one player who you know well, Nathan Collins, who I think is a very good signing for the money. That solved one problem in the team, but if you look at them last season, Raul Jimenez, who, let's face it, and sadly, is not the same player that we saw 3 seasons ago after his life-threatening injury. He scored 6 goals, top scorer. He's not actually going to start the season because I think he's got an injury. Wolves, to me, seem like they might have problems. I watched an interview a while back with the manager, Bruno Lage, talking about how he was looking forward to getting new players in and fitting them into his new pattern of play. Well, they've signed one player, and that's a centre-half. I'd be worried about Wolves. And you've got that sort of upwardly mobile club, and you've got Steven Gerrard's Aston Villa would be one of those. One of the issues that you have in the Premier League is if you try and stay the same, you try and consolidate, others will go beyond you, and that's when you run into problems. And I do think when I look at the Premier League for next season, it does feel to me like there's a few clubs that are trying to consolidate for next season. I think that's possibly, and I think that is, it's a dangerous strategy in the Premier League.
Okay, well, we'll watch out for that. John, we'll check in a couple of weeks, no doubt. Thanks so much for the time.